Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I've had a few requests in the comments to cover Camden Town. Once again, one of those parts of London I was a little bit reluctant to. I actually don't live too far from here and I almost never come here for the pubs. But I thought I would do a little bit of digging. I've done my homework and maybe there are a few hidden gems to be found in this part of London. Let's go and take a look. Pub number one, the World's End. Please excuse all the roadworks, formerly known as the Old Mother Redcap. Cheers from the World's End. Definitely one of those pubs where I'm going to need to do the audio at home. It's a sort of metal / rock pub, so the sound system perpetually seems to have Black Sabbath and its ilk on there. If that's your sort of thing, you're going to have a good time here. If not, perhaps not. The present building apparently dates to 1875 and the architect was Henry Hewitt Bridgman. He was also the architect of the Camden Turkish Baths, immediately to the north of where Camden Town tube station sits today. It's built of yellow stock brick in 3 stories. There are triangular pediments and facers in the stucco above windows on the first floor. At the top is something like a roof lantern or a cupola. I probably haven't used the correct architectural term for this, like a little hat. And there's an alcove in there, which I think I read somewhere at one time contained either a figure of Mother Redcap or possibly just her cap, some reference to the pub's former name. The now closed Black Cap across the street still has a bust at the roof level. I think that was similarly called the Mother Black Cap at one point in time and was also named after a supposed witch. Inside, I think there was a fairly radical remodelling in the 1980s. The large atrium-like bar towards the back now was added at that time. That space is all very modern, but it does include an old sign, or probably more likely a reproduction, for the Old Mother Redcap, the pub's former name. There's a smaller bar room towards the front of the pub. Sadly, that wasn't open yet. I think it opens at 4 p.m, so it was closed on my visit. And that looks at least a bit more traditional. I'm not sure if they are genuinely original features or possibly just a 1980s recreation of what they imagine a Victorian pub interior might have looked like, but that includes an interesting collection of familiar old pub knickknacks over that entrance: pots, jugs, vases, brass cider cups, an old voltmeter, a model ship, and so on. There is some booth seating separated by glazed partition in that more traditional area, and then back in the more modern bit there is a cabinet of butterflies. We should probably briefly touch on the pub's modern name, the World's End. There are several pubs dotted around London called this, and the Dictionary of Pub Names says that this is common all over the UK for pubs that are in a remote area. It actually would have been quite an appropriate name for the pub in its original guise, because this pub predates all of Camden. If we look at John Rock's map of 1746, we can see there was nothing here but fields and the Old Mother Redcap. It was literally this pub, possibly 1 or 2 other buildings, and that was it for Camden at that time. The majority of the development of Camden started in the late 18th century, I think the 1790s. So who was this Old Mother Redcap person? The main source I'm using here is a letter from one Mr. Henry Foxall, apparently penned in 1666, yes, the year of the Great Fire of London, which was somehow miraculously unearthed and published in 1843. It doesn't sound hugely credible to me, but here we go anyway. Old Mother Redcap was an old lady who lived alone in a cottage on this site in what would have at that point in history been open countryside outside of London. As always seems to be the way in folklore for old ladies living in cottages alone in the middle of nowhere, she had developed a skill for concocting herbal medicines, and of course was occasionally accused of being a witch. Henry Foxall passed by here with his friend Lord Rochester. If the date of the letter is accurate, and that's a big if, or indeed if these events ever happened at all, then that would be John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester. They found a mob assembled outside Old Mother Redcap's cottage, baying for revenge because one of her herbal remedies had poisoned a young woman. Lord Rochester, something of a prankster, thought he would help the situation by dressing up as the devil, sneaking into Mother Redcap's cottage and then taunting her about her wrongdoings. This seemingly terrified Old Mother Redcap, and she was found frozen like a statue the next day with limbs so stiff the undertaker had to break them to get her in a coffin. Some sources claim that a pub named after Mother Redcap on the site of her cottage or thereabouts was established as early as the 1690s. It is also apparently depicted in the same year as John Rock's map, 1746, in this engraving. As noted, the current building dates to 1875, and here's an early 1900s photo of the pub where the whole street scene looks a lot nicer than it does today. According to Camera's website, the World's End today is operated by a company called Glendola Leisure. I can't say I've ever heard of them before. That main bar in the atrium, the larger bar in the atrium, doesn't appear to have any cask ale, no real ale, no hand pumps. So I had to just go for what was on the keg taps, and I went for a half of Camden Stout. Pub number 2, the Dublin Castle. Cheers from the Dublin Castle. I think this terrace forms part of a Georgian run of buildings, possibly 1820s, but it's a bit hard to tell from the frontage of the Dublin Castle itself what its individual age is, and it's quite possible it was rebuilt at some point slightly later in the 19th century. It does seem to have a bit more ornamentation than its immediate neighbours, which look more Georgian to me, and that includes some arches over these windows on the first floor, and a set of, I think, Corinthian pillars running along the ground floor frontage. Note also this plaque about madness over the door as you go in. Inside there are mock Tudor touches to the bar counter and some of the walls, and I almost wonder if it's mock Tudor, as it has a slightly sort of 1960s vibe. So there was a big spike of mock Tudor in the interwar period, and it was then revived again. There was a revival of the revival, and lots of music memorabilia that of course attest to this pub's main claim to fame as a music venue in more recent decades. You can see various band posters and murals and photos around the pub documenting bands that this pub is associated with, including probably most famously Madness. Madness played one of their very first gigs here in the late 1970s, 1979 I think it was. Other bands played some of their earliest gigs here, including Blur, and Amy Winehouse also spent some time both performing and I believe even working behind the bar here. Towards the back of the pub is the music venue for which it's most famous. There's a stage area in there. There is a now widely debunked story that these castle pubs in Camden, there are a collection of them, were originally built to keep the labourers from the different regions of Britain and Ireland apart so that they didn't start fighting. Here we have the Dublin Castle. Just down the road on Parkway here is the Windsor Castle. Not too far from here is the Edinburgh Castle, and also over in Primrose Hill there is a Pembroke Castle. Unfortunately, the dates don't really quite work out for that, appealing though it is, story to be true. The Dublin Castle here is believed to have dated from the early 1820s, so it is quite possible that this may have been used in its earliest days by Irish navvies, particularly in the building of the Regent's Canal, which was completed in 1820, and with the London and Birmingham Railway, which ran into Euston, and I think that was completed in the late 1830s. However, the other pubs with the castle name didn't come into being until later than that. The Edinburgh Castle wasn't first established until 1839. The Pembroke Castle in Primrose Hill didn't come into being until the 1860s, and I think the Windsor Castle here was also of a similar age. The Windsor Castle of those four is the one that no longer exists, and today in its place there is a Five Guys that was covered in scaffolding. That establishment date of around about 1820 for the Dublin Castle here suggests that it would have already existed at the time of Greenwood's map of around 1827. And you can see a small run of buildings along Park Street, as it was known then, now known as Parkway, and it's possible one of those, possibly towards the end there, was the Dublin Castle. Despite this story about the castle pubs being likely apocryphal, there certainly were tensions between those different groups around that time. Here's a newspaper account from 1846 about a large brawl which broke out at the Roundhouse not too far from here. You can see the Dublin Castle marked on Parkway or Park Street, as it was known then, in this 1890s Ordnance Survey map. Note that the Windsor Castle, which likely would have existed down the road at this point in time, isn't marked, and that's probably because it was a beer house rather than a public house. And on this mid-1900s OS map, you can see both pubs marked with a PH. I think it still remains an independent pub today. I don't think in its current incarnation there was any real ale on tap, so it was just a choice from the keg taps, and I went for a half of Guinness. Pub number 3, the Elephant's Head. This was another pub where there was no outside drinking space, nor could I find any good quiet space inside. This building is not listed by Historic England, but it does have a local listing from Camden Borough Council. They believe it to be a mid-19th century building, and they particularly call attention to the tiles on the exterior and the curved window at the corner. Some of the other highlights they mention are the dentil cornice to the windows and also to the parapet. It is quite an attractive pub exterior actually, but it's right on one of the very main, very busy, very touristy streets of Camden, so I can quite understand that might put some people off. Inside, there is some kind of partition in the vestibule as you enter that has matchboard panelling and leaded windows with Gothic arches, and this Gothic theme continues throughout much of the pub. I assume all of this is much more recent than the pub's Victorian origins. There is this unusual Gothic arcade along the bar counter. I spent a while staring at this. I suspect this was a former church fitting, and there are definitely other parts of the pub interior that look like they've also been salvaged from a church. Particularly these bits of wood carving at the end, demarking part of this stage area, look very much like the ends from pew seating in a church. The bar back is possibly not related to this slightly bizarre church interior refit, and that has some nice carving in it, which could be late Victorian, I could just about believe, including some columns, possibly Corinthian capitals there, and they're fronted by mirrored panels, which I think are much more modern, but that back structure there looks like it could be a bit older. Interestingly, the bar back fitting extends well beyond where the bar counter is today, suggesting that the bar counter has moved at some point in history. You can see a large section of the old bar back extending along a wall without any bar counter directly in front of it. The name Elephant's Head is intriguing. There are two possible theories put forward for this on Camera's page about the pub. The first is that it relates to Camden Brewery, which was nearby. We can see that on this 1890s map located very close to the pub. And they adopted the elephant's head as their logo, quite possibly because the elephant's head is part of the coat of arms of the Marquis and originally the Earl and Baron or whatever it was of Camden. Charles Pratt was the first, who was also responsible for the development of the area starting in the 1790s. You can still see one of the old brewery buildings just round the corner from the pub. It's now called the Elephant House. It's on the corner of Kentish Town Road and Hawley Crescent, near to the Devonshire Arms, and the Devonshire Arms may also have been a Camden Brewery pub originally. At least one old photo of the pub suggests that they may have sold their elephant stouts and ales. The other theory for how the pub gained the name Elephant's Head is that it simply came directly from the coat of arms without that circuitous route. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for the pub was this one from 1865, which talks about a transfer of licenses. And here is an account of 1874 about a savage assault on the premises, a customer here biting a member of staff on the thigh. I'm not actually sure who operates this pub today. It possibly is independently ran. Once again, there was no real ale on offer. It was a pretty poor showing in Camden Town for real ale, and I had to go for the keg tap, so I went for a half of Guinness yet again. Pub number 4, the Old Eagle. Cheers from the Old Eagle. I have to admit, I was flagging a little bit with the first 3 pubs. I was really kind of struggling to enjoy any of them. They were all just a bit, I don't know, not my kind of thing. But this has been a big pick-me-up. This is clearly much more of a pubby pub. Perhaps most of all, I was greeted by a pub cat, which is always a delightful thing to find in a pub, and he or she, I can't tell, looks like a bit of a character. Looking at the exterior quickly, I think like the Dublin Castle, we have a building which forms part of a Georgian terrace again, but the pub itself may have been rebuilt somewhat later in the 19th century. It looks like originally it would have had 3 entrances, but just 2 of those are in use today. Each of those entrances is flanked by pillars. and has fanlights above. Those two still in use entrances have mosaic flooring. One of them has the eagle depicted and the other has it in words. Both of those are really quite nice, I thought. This is on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. Just a 1-star rating, but I do think it's still pretty nice. As they describe it, an L-shaped panelled bar counter, which looks convincingly late Victorian. And they say that possibly some parts of the bar back fitting may also date to that late Victorian era. Towards the back of the pub is a sort of conservatory style element before you get out to this little patio that I'm sitting in now, and that has some stained glass in it. CAMRA's notes believe that to be interwar. And once again we see the logo of the eagle there. There are also a number of more modern, quirky additions to the pub, including a bunch of busts and statuettes and figurines, classical figures. And most strikingly, when you see the pub from the exterior, there are all these musical instruments hanging in the windows. It's got a sort of slightly Irish pub atmosphere to it, and I think they do still possibly have some regular musical performances here, and I think that's probably what the musical instruments hanging in the windows are giving you a clue as to. At the time of Greenwood's map of 1828, did I say 1827 earlier maybe? At least part of College Street, which was at that point not yet royal, was already laid out, and there is even a little stretch of buildings, and one of those may roughly correspond to the current location of the Old Eagle, but I get the sense it probably dates from around 1850, a little later than that. The earliest written record I found for it was this newspaper mention of 1852. Here's the pub marked with a PH on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. Note how the station now known as Camden Road was at that time referred to as Camden Town Station. That predated the tube station that we know today by several decades. It was built in 1850 compared to Camden Town Tube Station being opened in 1907. In the year Camden Town Tube Station opened, the pub was tangentially involved in a much talked about murder case, which later became known as the Camden Town murder. Emily Dimmock was murdered at her home, and this was the last place she'd visited prior to returning home, the Old Eagle. The main suspect was an artist named Robert Wood, and much of the investigation focused on his handwriting appearing on, I think, a postcard and possibly also a letter that were found in Emily Dimmock's house. Today it's actually a Green King pub. It's the only chain pub I think we're encountering on this tour of Camden, and yet bizarrely the one that felt to me at least like it had the most character and the most individuality and felt the most pubby. I'm having a half of actually the first cask bitter of the day, the first real ale of the day, albeit I suspect this is a Green King beer produced with a different name by them. It's Hardy and Hanson's Kimberley Bitter. It's a nice break from all the keg stout I've been having to make do with so far today. Pub number 5, the Golden Lion. Cheers from the Golden Lion. This is a very eye-catching building, and it's very much of that late Victorian, early Edwardian period. It's almost certainly round about the year 1900, give or take a decade. It's predominantly built in red brick, and we often see this kind of white banding on buildings of this era, but here unusually it's blue, and I wonder if that painting in blue is a later addition. It's a very ornate building and really stands out in its surroundings, given that it barely has any. Most of the other buildings around it have been demolished at various times, and we'll come back to that later. I like these kind of grills beneath the windows on the upper floors. They almost look like a sort of very, very shallow Juliet balcony. The gable also has quite a lot of embellishment with these scrolls and so forth. The ground floor looks solidly in that late Victorian, early Edwardian period, with that classic combo of red and grey granite, or pink and grey granite. Quite possibly we have the standard Larvikite and Swedish coastal here, but as always it could be something Aberdeenshire. This is another pub on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. I think once again it's just a 1-star rating. They point out the star feature as being the bar back, which they believe dates to the Victorian period. There is an interesting melange of different styles here because we have some Victorian features, and then mixed in with those we have some interwar additions from when Charringtons took over this pub in the 1930s. So the bar back, likely Victorian, the bar counter also possibly Victorian. The names of the saloon and private bars are spelled out in a sort of stained glass above 2 of the entrances, but then there is a later addition on the door on that private bar entrance that says off sales, and that's likely a 1930s edition that dates to that Charringtons era. Of course nowadays it has all been opened up inside, but as CAMRA mentioned in their notes, you can see some vestiges of the original layout. There is a part of what looks like an original Victorian partition at one end of the bar that would have separated probably the public bar from the private bar. Towards the back of the pub is what CAMRA describes as a chunky Devon marble fireplace. Other parts of the interior are much more modern, but I think that bar back in particular is very nicely preserved, and that's a rather standout feature. We can be fairly sure of when this pub first was established. It looks like it was 1852. That's of course not the building we see today, some earlier form of it, and you can see it here on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. Here is the pub again marked with a PH on the mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map. And I believe this map was immediately post World War II. You can see there is a large empty space immediately to the side of the pub, and coincidentally that's also how we see it again today. At the time of that mid-1900s OS map, that was as a result of bombing in the Blitz, and I think some of its neighbours were subsequently rebuilt but have been now demolished again to make way for some development or other. This colour-coded map shows exactly where bomb damage was in London post World War II and shows where it was at its worst extent, and you can see the buildings immediately to the side of where the pub is now are coloured in black, and that shows the greatest level of bomb damage, complete destruction. In both that map and that earlier Ordnance Survey map you can see the Idris factories marked nearby. That was a company who manufactured soft drinks. Here's a 1920s advert showing some of the products they made. Many of these are still familiar a century on, but Koolime and Phosphade are certainly not drinks you could still order in a pub today. Koolime is apparently their brand name for something we would probably recognise as limeade today, a fizzy lime juice based drink. Still not entirely sure what Phosphade is though. I think it might possibly be something a little bit like tonic water based on some of these later advertisements. No Phosphade was available here, nor was any real ale, so once again I had to settle for a half of Guinness. Does that say Camden Town in the background? Right, that's going to be it for today's video from Camden. A mixed bag, that often seems to be the conclusion to some of these perhaps less obvious venues in London. I would say the first 3 pubs left me feeling a little bit cold. The final 2, a bit of an improvement. So hopefully there's some food for thought there. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.